Hi, I'm Mina.
And I'm Yules.
Thanks for tuning in to Artificially Informed.
Imagine you are holding your breath, not just for a few seconds, but for days.
Oh man, just thinking about that makes me anxious.
Right. You are relying entirely on this highly pressurized, incredibly fragile aluminum can to keep you alive, and you are hurtling through a completely hostile void at thousands of miles an hour.
It is the ultimate test of an engineered system under unimaginable pressure.
Exactly. And then you have to hit the Earth's atmosphere at exactly the right angle, because if you come in too shallow, you just bounce off into deep space forever.
Yeah, and if you come in too steep, you incinerate.
So no pressure. But that is exactly what just happened. Welcome to today's deep dive, you guys. Today is Tuesday, April 14, 2026, and we are taking you on a massive journey today.
We really have an incredible stack of reporting to get through.
We do. We are going from the fringes of space to the literal depths of the oceans, unearthing ancient empires and navigating this incredibly tense, high-stakes geopolitical chessboard that is basically dominating the globe right now.
I mean, what is so fascinating here is how interconnected all these seemingly disparate stories actually are.
Definitely.
Whether we are talking about Roman military history or a modern naval blockade in the Middle East, it all comes down to how humans manage power and how we manage resources.
That is the perfect vibe check for today. So let's jump right into that space survival story. The Artemis II crew has officially returned to Earth.
Which is just a monumental human achievement.
It really is. We are talking about the first crewed lunar mission in over half a century. NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, confirmed that they splashed down safely.
That was in the Pacific Ocean, right?
Yeah, right off the coast of California in the United States. So astronauts Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Koch, and Canadian Space Agency astronaut Jeremy Hansen, they just completed a 10-day lunar flyby.
We haven't had human eyes looking at the far side of the moon in person since the Apollo era. But I think what is really crucial for people to understand about Artemis II is that it wasn't a moon landing.
Right, yeah, break that down for me, because I think a lot of people see the words lunar mission and they wonder, well, why didn't they plant a flag this time around?
So the Apollo missions were, in many ways, a sprint. It was this brilliant, monumental sprint just to get there first.
The space race.
Exactly. The Artemis program is an entirely different beast. It is about establishing a permanent, sustainable human presence. So Artemis II was fundamentally about testing the Orion spacecraft's life support system.
With actual human biology inside it.
Yes, because when you were flying 250,000 miles away from Earth, there was no quick abort scenario where you were home in an hour.
Right, you can't just pull over.
Exactly. If a carbon dioxide scrubber fails or a thermal regulation system glitches, the crew is entirely on their own. They were testing the manual piloting capabilities, the radiation shielding, the D-space communication networks.
So it's basically the proving ground for everything we need to establish a lunar base.
And eventually to push outward to Mars.
I was reading the breakdown of the splashdown, and there was this very human detail that I just loved. After the U.S. military and NASA recovery teams got them out of the open water and onto the USS John P. Murtha for medical checks, Christina Koch apparently gave the outside of the Orion capsule a hug.
Wow.
Yeah, she just wrapped her arms around the scorched metal.
Well, you have to imagine the psychological bond that forms between a crew and their ship. For 10 days, that machine was their entire world.
It kept them alive.
It protected them from a vacuum that would boil their blood in seconds, and it shielded them from a re-entry heat of nearly 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit.
That is just wild to think about. And, while they were coming back down, managing all that pressure, we had another vital operation happening right in low Earth orbit.
Oh, you mean the supply drop to the ISS?
Yeah. I saw this really fascinating piece about the Northrop Grumman Cygnus XL spacecraft. They actually named it the SS Stephen R. Nagel. It's an uncrewed cargo ship, and it just docked at the International Space Station, the ISS.
Dropping off, what, about 11,000 pounds of supplies?
Exactly. But the part that really caught my eye was the research payload. They sent up equipment to cultivate algae and plants in microgravity.
And see, that ties directly into the Artemis mission's long-term goals.
How so?
Well, if you are planning a mission to Mars, which could take upwards of 2 years round trip, you simply cannot pack enough freeze-dried food to sustain a crew.
The mass and weight would just be way too much, right?
It would be prohibitive. You have to figure out how to grow your own food.
So why algae? I mean, if I'm stuck on a spaceship for 2 years, I think I'd rather have a potato or, I don't know, space tomatoes.
A space tomato would certainly be better for morale, but from an engineering and biological standpoint, algae is a miracle worker. We are talking about organisms like spirulina or chlorella.
Okay.
First off, they are incredibly nutrient dense. They are packed with proteins and essential vitamins. But more importantly, they are the foundation of a closed-loop ecological life support system.
Meaning they recycle what the astronauts produce.
Precisely. So humans breathe in oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. Algae, through photosynthesis, does the exact opposite.
Right. It breathes in the carbon dioxide and exhales fresh oxygen.
Yes. Furthermore, algae can be used to help filter and process wastewater. And it grows incredibly fast, doubling its mass in a matter of hours under the right light conditions.
Wow. So the research on the ISS is trying to figure out how all that works without gravity.
Exactly. They're trying to understand exactly how microgravity affects that cellular growth. Do the cells divide the same way when there is literally no up or down?
That is just wild. It's essentially trying to miniaturize the entire Earth's biosphere and stick it in a metal tube. But let me pause you there, because here is where the grand vision of space totally collides with the reality of Earth.
The funding.
Yes. While we have these incredible scientists figuring out how to balance an artificial ecosystem, the financial ecosystem funding them is currently under massive threat.
You're referring to the proposed budget cuts.
I am. There's a very serious warning coming from the Planetary Society regarding the White House's proposed budget. They are basically sounding the alarm that severe funding cuts to NASA's Science Directorate could outright cancel vital planetary exploration and Earth observation missions.
It is a really critical juncture for the agency right now. And it highlights a fundamental tension in how we allocate resources as a society.
Oh, absolutely.
But because the scientific community is devastated. These aren't just vanity projects or, cool pictures of distant galaxies. Many of these missions are Earth observation satellites.
Right, the ones looking back at us.
Exactly. They track global weather patterns, they monitor soil moisture for agriculture, measure ice sheet depletion, and track atmospheric pollutants.
So they give us the baseline data.
Yeah, data that governments and militaries worldwide use to make massive strategic decisions. Cutting these programs creates a blind spot in our understanding of our own planet.
Okay, I have to play devil's advocate here, because this is a debate you hear in every coffee shop and town hall across the country. We have a global economy that is frankly buckling right now.
It is definitely a tough economic climate.
People are struggling with inflation, housing costs, basic groceries. Can we really look a struggling family in the eye and say, sorry, we need these billions of dollars to figure out how space algae grows? Or to send a probe to a dead rock in the outer solar system?
That's a fair point.
Like, how do you justify that kind of expenditure when the immediate pain on Earth is so high? Cutting NASA's budget while prepping for Mars is like packing for a cross-country road trip but deciding to save money by not buying gas.
Well, it is a completely valid and necessary question. The argument that we should fix Earth before we look to the stars is very intuitive.
Yeah.
However, the counter-argument from the aerospace and scientific sectors is that space exploration is an investment. It's not a bonfire where we just burn cash.
How so? Because to a lot of people, the money just disappears into the sky.
Well, the money isn't spent in space. It is spent here on Earth. It employs hundreds of thousands of engineers, software developers, metallurgists, technicians.
Good point.
But more importantly, the technological dividends of solving the impossible problems of space travel inevitably bleed into our daily lives.
Yeah.
The miniaturization of electronics, which basically makes your smartphone possible, that was driven by the Apollo program's need to save weight.
Oh, wow. I didn't realize that.
Yeah, and advanced water purification systems developed for the ISS are now deployed in disaster zones globally. Medical imaging technologies like MRIs, they have their roots in digital signal processing developed by NASA to enhance pictures of the moon.
So you are saying that trying to keep a human alive in the most hostile environment imaginable forces us to invent things that make life better in the relatively easy environment of Earth.
Precisely. It is a long-term economic and technological engine. The concern with the budget cuts is that by saving a small percentage of the federal budget today, you might be strangling the innovations that will define the economy of the 2030s and 2040s.
That makes a lot of sense. It's that classic struggle between the immediate crisis and the long-term vision. And speaking of the immediate environment, the Artemis capsule splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. And it turns out the void of space isn't the only place where we are making massive discoveries about alien-looking worlds.
True.
Let's dive down into the ocean itself. I was reading this incredible dispatch about marine biology off the coast of Spain.
Ah, the sperm whale footage. It is genuinely breathtaking.
It really is. So a researcher named Rui Prieto and his team managed to capture something on camera that has been rumored for a long time, but almost never actually seen.
Yeah.
They filmed sperm whales head ramming each other, just full-on head-butting in the open ocean.
Which is an extraordinary piece of behavioral evidence. But to really understand why this is so significant, we need to look at the anatomy of a sperm whale.
Please do, because my very first thought was, wouldn't hitting something with a head that big just give you a massive concussion?
You would certainly think so. A sperm whale's head is completely disproportionate to the rest of his body. It can actually make up to a third of its entire length.
That's huge.
It is. And inside that massive, blocky forehead is a structure called the spermaceti organ. It is filled with a specialized waxy oil.
Oh, which is why they were hunted to near extinction in the 19th century, right? For that oil to fuel lamps.
Exactly. But biologically, the primary function of that oil-filled organ is echolocation. It acts as an incredibly powerful acoustic lens.
How does that work?
The whale produces a click in its nasal passages, and that sound wave travels through the spermaceti oil, which basically focuses it into a directed beam. It's how they find giant squid in the pitch-black depths of the ocean.
Okay, so it's a giant sonar dome.
Pretty much.
But why are they crashing their sonar domes into each other?
Well, that is the mystery this footage is helping to solve. The researchers hypothesize that this head ramming is highly complex social dynamic. It is likely a way for males to establish dominance within the pod.
Oh, interesting.
Or perhaps it serves as a physical courting display to impress females.
So it is essentially an underwater, multi-ton version of two guys getting into a bar fight to impress a date.
It is a bit more majestic than a bar fight, but the biological imperative of proving physical superiority is very similar. Yes.
Right.
But what is mechanically fascinating is how they actually survive the impact.
Yeah.
That spermaceti organ, despite being filled with oil, also contains incredibly tough connective tissue.
So it acts like a buffer.
Exactly. It acts as a massive shock absorber. It protects their brain and their delicate acoustic machinery from the sheer kinetic energy of two 50-ton animals colliding.
It just shows you how much is happening beneath the surface that we are entirely oblivious to. Complex societies, physical dominance rituals, all happening right under the waves.
Absolutely.
But while the ocean can be a place of discovery, it is also a source of unimaginable, terrifying power. I want to shift our focus from the coast of Spain back to the Pacific Ocean, but further west. We have a dire, rapidly escalating situation unfolding right now.
You are looking at the meteorological reports for super typhoon Sinlacua.
I am, and I gotta say, the numbers are staggering. Sinlacua is currently bearing down on the northern Mariana Islands.
Yeah.
For anyone unfamiliar with the geography, this is a United States territory in the western Pacific Ocean. The storm is directly threatening the roughly 50,000 residents living on the main islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Rota.
The intensity of this storm just cannot be overstated. The latest readouts show it packing sustained winds of 173 miles per hour. That is 278 kilometers per hour.
Let's just pause on that number for a second. 173 miles per hour. I've been in a car going maybe 80, and the wind noise alone is deafening.
It's terrifying.
I cannot fathom a wall of water and air moving at almost twice that speed tearing through a community.
It firmly places Sinlacua as a Category 5 storm, and it is the strongest typhoon recorded globally so far this year. At those wind speeds, you're not just talking about roof damage. You're talking about the complete structural failure of residential buildings, massive storm surges that will inundate coastal areas, and the complete obliteration of the local power grid and communication infrastructure.
It's a total nightmare scenario. The reporting shows that U.S. President Donald Trump has officially authorized emergency disaster declarations. That clears the way for federal assistance and resources from FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency.
That's critical.
Yeah, military personnel on the islanders are actively seeking hardened shelter, and nearby Guam is also on high alert.
This crisis really highlights the acute, increasing vulnerability of remote island communities. When a storm like this hits a mainland coast, residents can evacuate inland.
But in the Marianas?
In the northern Marianas, there is no inland to run to. You are completely surrounded by the ocean that is currently trying to destroy your home.
And there is a heavy historical resonance to this specific location, isn't there? I mean, Saipan isn't just a random dot on a map.
Far from it. Saipan holds a very dark, very significant place in history. It was the site of one of the most brutal, bloody battles of the Pacific Theater during World War II back in 1944.
Right.
The island still bears the scars of that conflict. There were old bunkers, rusted artillery, and the tragic legacy of the cliffs where thousands perished.
To see a place with such a deep history of human conflict now bracing for a relentless assault from nature, it really adds a very sobering layer to the tragedy unfolding.
It is a stark reminder of human fragility.
Yeah.
You build these settlements, you fight wars over these tiny strips of land, and then a thermodynamic engine in the atmosphere spins up and threatens to wipe it all clean.
It really is the ultimate system under pressure.
Yeah.
But speaking of systems and water and pressure, I actually want to pivot to something entirely different. It is still about how we deal with water, but on a much, much smaller, almost comical scale.
Oh, I think I know where you're going with this.
While the Pacific deals with a massive typhoon, there is a bizarre battle over water usage happening inside our own bathrooms.
Ah, the transatlantic plumbing divide. I was wondering when we would get to this.
I couldn't resist. I read this deep dive by Deutsche Welle, DW, breaking down why the United States has stubbornly, almost pathologically, stayed behind the rest of the developed world when it comes to toilet technology.
It sounds trivial, but it is actually a fascinating case study in infrastructure and cultural inertia.
Exactly. The reporting points out that American toilets use significantly more water per flush than their European counterparts. And it all comes down to the mechanics of how the bowl actually empties.
Right.
In the U.S., the standard is a siphonic or suction-based design.
Right. And to explain the difference for you, in a standard American siphonic toilet, you have a high water level in the bowl. When you flush, water rushes in, creating a siphon effect in the trapway.
That's the curved pipe underneath, right?
Yes. It literally sucks the waste in the water out of the bowl.
Which requires a massive volume of water to initiate and maintain that suction. But the European models do it completely differently.
Yes. European plumbing largely relies on a washdown system. The bowl has a much lower water level, and the trapway is typically wider and less convoluted.
Okay.
When you flush, gravity simply washes the water down from the rim, pushing the waste out. It requires a fraction of the water to achieve the same exact result.
And the kicker here, the part that is so uniquely bureaucratic, is that the U.S. government actually recognized this waste decades ago.
Oh yeah, back in the 90s.
Yeah, in 1992, the U.S. passed the Energy Policy Act. This legally mandated that all new toilets use no more than 1.6 gallons of water per flush, which was down from the old 3.5-gallon standard.
But the way the industry responded is what caused the problem.
Yeah.
Instead of redesigning the toilets to be efficient washdown systems, American manufacturers largely just modified their existing siphonic designs to use less water.
Which is why, for the last 30 years, people have been complaining about having to flush 2 or 3 times.
Exactly.
They took a system that relied on volume and just starved it of water. So why are we so attached to this flawed design? Why not just adopt the European model?
Because changing infrastructure is incredibly difficult, even on a micro scale. It comes down to cultural expectations. Americans are accustomed to a large pool of water in the bowl. A washdown system, with its low water level, often leaves marks on the bowl, requiring the user to use a toilet brush more frequently.
God forbid.
Right. But beyond cultural preference, there is the sunk cost of manufacturing. The molds, the factories, the plumbing supply lines, an entire multi-billion-dollar industry is calibrated for the siphonic design.
So it's just too expensive to change?
To retool all of that and to re-educate the consumer base is a monumental task. It proves that even when legislation forces change, if you don't address the underlying infrastructure and cultural habits, the system will just find a clunky, inefficient workaround.
It is so funny to think about. We just talked about engineers designing a closed-loop microgravity ecosystem to keep astronauts alive on their way to Mars. But down here on Earth, we refuse to adopt a better toilet flush because we're used to the water swirling a certain way.
It perfectly illustrates how deeply entrenched our systems become and how resistant humans are to fundamentally altering how they operate day to day.
And speaking of deeply entrenched systems resisting change, let's look at one of the biggest systems in human history. Let's talk about the Roman Empire.
A seamless transition from modern plumbing, which the Romans, of course, pioneered with their aqueducts and cloacae, to imperial survival strategy.
Hey, I do my best. So I was reading a fascinating piece by historian Tim Newcomb, and he is breaking down new archaeological evidence. He focuses on what he calls a hidden army inside the Roman Empire.
Okay.
Now, the common perception of Rome is this monolithic, centralized superpower. An emperor sits in Rome, points a finger, and legions march out to conquer.
That is the Hollywood version, yes. a rigidly top-down centralized command structure.
But Newcomb's research points out that during the Third Century Crisis, this centralized model completely fell apart.
And we should provide context on what that crisis actually was because it is crucial to the story.
Go for it.
The Third Century Crisis was a period where the Roman Empire nearly collapsed under the combined weight of massive barbarian invasions, a devastating plague, economic hyperinflation, and a revolving door of emperors assassinating each other.
Sounds like a mess.
It was.
Yeah.
At one point, the empire literally splintered into 3 separate competing states.
Which sounds like a recipe for total destruction. But Newcomb points out that Rome survived specifically because it abandoned that rigid top-down control. They leaned into decentralized power. He highlights leaders like Odenathus of Palmyra. Can you explain who that was?
Odenathus is a fascinating historical figure.
Mm-hmm.
Palmyra was a wealthy, vital oasis city in what is now modern-day Syria. It sat right on the frontier between the Roman Empire and their great rival, the Sassanid Persian Empire.
Okay, setting the stage.
During the height of the crisis, the Roman Emperor Valerian was actually captured in battle by the Persian king Shapur I. It was an unprecedented humiliation.
Wow.
Yeah, the entire eastern flank of the Roman Empire was completely exposed.
So without orders from Rome, what does Odenathus do?
He doesn't wait for a new Roman legion that is never going to come. He takes matters into his own hands. Odenathus essentially raised a private army. But crucially, he didn't rely strictly on traditional Roman legionary tactics.
What did he use instead?
He utilized indigenous native forces, heavy cavalry, armored archers, basically troops who understood the desert terrain and the Persian tactics.
So he franchised out the defense of the empire?
Exactly. He operated with massive autonomy. He launched a devastating counteroffensive against the Persians, driving them back and securing the entire eastern Mediterranean for Rome.
That's incredible.
Nominally, he declared loyalty to the Roman emperor, but practically, he was an independent king commanding a local, highly specialized force.
And the central authority in Rome just let him do it.
They had no choice. What this new historical analysis shows is that Rome survived its darkest century because it allowed regional commanders to adapt. When the central nervous system of the empire broke down, the local nodes were strong enough to operate independently.
They traded absolute centralized control for localized resilience.
Precisely.
That is such a profound historical lesson about power. Because you look at modern geopolitics and you see that exact same tension playing out today between centralized unions and independent states.
Absolutely.
Let's look at Europe right now. The European Union is an attempt to centralize economic and political power. But they are dealing with a massive fracture in Hungary.
Yes, the recent election results out of Budapest are sending shockwaves through the halls of Brussels.
According to reports from France 24 and DW, we have a massive political earthquake. Peter Magyar, leading the Tisza party, has achieved a landslide election victory. He has officially ousted Viktor Orban and his Fidesz party after 16 years of continuous rule.
To really understand the magnitude of this, you have to understand Orban's tenure. For 16 years, Viktor Orban has been a dominant, deeply controversial figure in Europe.
Right.
He steered Hungary on a staunchly nationalist illiberal course.
Yeah.
He continuously clashed with the central authority of the European Union over issues like judicial independence, LGBTQ rights, and media consolidation.
And more recently, he was a massive thorn in the side of the EU regarding foreign policy, specifically his relatively warm relations with Vladimir Putin and his obstruction of aid to Ukraine.
Right. Orban essentially acted as a veto point within the centralized EU structure. So you can imagine that the leadership in the EU, figures like Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, are likely breathing a massive sigh of relief right now.
The reports say they are applauding the result. They are hoping this means a more cooperative Hungary, specifically when it comes to unblocking a massive 90 billion euro loan package meant to support Ukraine's defense and economy.
There's a catch.
Exactly. Diving into the profile of Peter Magyar, the EU might be celebrating a bit too early. He isn't exactly the liberal pro-centralization champion they might be hoping for.
This is where the nuance is critical. Peter Magyar is not an outsider from the liberal left. He is actually a former insider. He comes from within Orban's own conservative political circles.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, he ran a brilliant populist campaign that capitalized on immense voter fatigue. People were just tired of the corruption, the stagnant living standards, and the cronyism associated with Orban's inner circle.
But what about his actual policies?
His policies are still deeply conservative. He maintains a very strict anti-immigration stance, which aligns with much of the Hungarian electorate. And crucially, regarding Ukraine, He is walking a very cautious line.
So he's not fully on board with the EU plan.
No, he is not pledging the unconditional, open-ended military support that Brussels wants.
So he is playing a very delicate balancing act. He wants to unlock the billions in EU funds that were frozen under Orban, but he knows his voting base doesn't want to get dragged deeper into the war next door.
Right.
And Russia is watching this tightrope walk very closely. The Kremlin actually released a statement hoping to maintain pragmatic relations with Hungary, pointing out that Magyar still secured over 53% of the vote.
Magyar is essentially playing the role of a modern Odenathus. He is a local leader who has secured power by focusing on indigenous domestic concerns.
That's a great parallel.
He will nominally align with the central authority, the EU, to get the resources he needs, but he will guard his local autonomy fiercely. He is not going to just take orders from Brussels if it jeopardizes his domestic standing.
And Brussels has a lot more to worry about right now than just Hungarian politics. The broader empire of the EU is looking at its own defense capabilities, and honestly, they are hitting the panic button.
Things are escalating.
Yeah, while the politicians debate funding, the military brass is looking at personnel. We have a stark warning from Andrei Denk, the head of the European Defense Agency, the EDA. He is stating publicly that the EU may need to reinstate compulsory military service.
This is a direct reaction to an acute, terrifying math problem. The volunteer recruitment models across Western Europe are failing to meet their targets, just as the existential threat perception on the continent is at its highest point since the Cold War.
I want to focus on the societal impact of this. Because we are talking about Western Europe. We are talking about generations, millennials, Gen Z, who have grown up in a post-Cold War era defined by open borders, economic integration, Erasmus study abroad programs, and just an unprecedented era of peace.
Yeah, it's a completely different mindset.
To suddenly pivot and tell a 20-year-old in Germany or France, you must put on a uniform and learn how to fire an assault rifle because war is possible, that is a staggering, traumatic paradigm shift.
It forces a massive confrontation regarding the social contract. For decades, the European model prioritized individual liberty, social welfare, and economic growth.
They didn't focus on hard power.
Right. They essentially outsourced the heavy lifting of hard defense to professional volunteer armies and, frankly, to the security umbrella provided by the United States through NATO.
Yeah.
But the protracted, brutal, industrial-scale war in Ukraine has shattered the illusion that a small, highly technical volunteer force is sufficient to deter or fight a major conventional conflict.
The reporting mentions that Germany is already seeing protests erupt over legislative proposals that could pave the way for conscription. People are terrified, but other countries are already moving ahead, right?
Yes. The countries closest to the threat, geographically, are moving the fastest. Finland and Lithuania, sharing borders with Russia, have already expanded their military service obligations.
Right.
Denmark and Latvia are taking historic steps to include women in their draft models to maximize their reserve pools.
So if you are a young European today, the debate is no longer theoretical. It is about a fundamental tension. How much individual freedom are you willing to sacrifice to ensure the collective security of your nation?
Exactly. The EDA is arguing that security is not a natural right. It is a condition that requires maintenance, and in dangerous times, it may require mandatory personal sacrifice from the citizenry.
And what makes that prospect even more terrifying for a potential conscript is looking at the type of war they are preparing for. Because the battlefield of the 2020s is fundamentally shifting away from human infantry.
It's changing rapidly.
Which brings us to the next massive shift in global power, the drone age, and the anxiety surrounding artificial intelligence.
The nature of warfare is evolving faster right now than at any point since the invention of the atomic bomb.
We have deeply alarming reports from the New York Times and RT analyzing the global AI drone race, and the consensus from the defense establishment is that the United States is reportedly losing ground rapidly to both Russia and China.
To understand the stakes here, we need to distinguish between a remote-controlled drone and an autonomous AI drone.
Okay, what's the difference?
For the last 20 years, the U.S. dominated the use of drones, like the Predator or Reaper. But those are essentially remote-controlled airplanes. There is a human pilot sitting in a trailer in Nevada, looking at a screen, making decisions.
But the report details a recent military parade in Beijing where China showcased next-generation autonomous combat aircraft. Explain what autonomous means in this context.
It means removing the human from the loop. These new drones are equipped with advanced computer vision, edge computing, and AI targeting algorithms.
So they decide on their own.
Yes, they are designed to fly over a battlefield, independently identify an enemy tank, artillery piece, or even personnel, and execute a strike without ever asking a human operator for permission.
That feels like crossing a massive ethical Rubicon.
It is the ultimate paradigm shift in the history of conflict. In traditional warfare, even with remote drones, there is a human ethical pause in the kill chain. A human looks at the target, assesses the collateral damage, weighs the morality and legality of the strike, and physically pulls the trigger.
And an algorithm doesn't have a conscience.
An algorithm processes pixel data and probability matrices at speeds a human brain simply cannot comprehend. It is entirely mathematical.
So what's the biggest fear here?
The fear within the U.S. defense sector is twofold. First, that they are lagging behind in fielding these specific autonomous swarm capabilities. And second, that once you field autonomous weapons, the pace of battle becomes so fast, driven by machine speed reactions, that human commanders completely lose control of the escalation ladder. A border skirmish could spiral into a massive conflict in minutes, simply because the AI systems react to each other instantly.
It's the anxiety of building a system you can no longer control. And that anxiety is not just isolated to generals in the Pentagon. It is spilling over into the civilian world, and it is getting violent.
Yeah, that story out of Texas.
Exactly. I was reading a local CBS News report out of Texas. An individual was arrested and charged with attempted murder and arson, the target, the home of Sam Altman, the CEO of OpenAI.
The motive behind this attack is what makes it so indicative of our current cultural moment.
The suspect told authorities they threw the Molotov cocktail because they genuinely believed that humanity is facing imminent extinction due to artificial intelligence. They wanted to kill the CEO to stop the technology.
It sounds like a movie.
Right. I mean, we always joke about science fiction tropes, but this is a real person in a Texas suburb trying to assassinate a tech executive to prevent the apocalypse.
It is a manifestation of extreme neo-Luddism, driven by profound societal panic. When a technology evolves at a pace that vastly outstrips the public's ability to understand it, or the government's ability to regulate it, it breeds an intense existential fear.
Because it feels like the future is being decided in a black box.
Exactly. For many people, AI isn't just a useful tool for writing emails. It represents a chaotic force that will usurp human labor, generate indistinguishable deepfakes that destroy objective truth, or, in the absolute extreme view of this suspect, literally decide humanity is obsolete.
Right.
This violent act, while isolated, is a symptom of a much broader, deep-seated anxiety about who is driving the car and whether the brakes even work anymore.
And it doesn't help that half the time the engineers building these large language models admit they don't entirely understand the neural pathways the AI is forming. But while citizens panic and the military scrambles, the tech megacorporations themselves are just quietly, methodically expanding their empires.
They are making huge moves.
Look at the business wires today. TechCrunch reports that Amazon is purchasing Globalstar for a staggering $11.57 billion.
This is a massive consolidation of infrastructure. Globalstar is a satellite communications company. By acquiring them, Amazon is vastly fleshing out its orbital infrastructure, likely integrating it with their Project Kuiper initiative to provide global broadband.
So they are building their own independent communication network in space.
Yes.
And Google is making massive moves on the ground. They are rolling out their Gemini personal intelligence feature to users in India. We are talking about integrating advanced AI directly into the daily digital lives, the personal emails, the calendars of hundreds of millions of people in one of the fastest growing markets on Earth.
They are establishing the digital infrastructure that will define the next century of commerce and interaction.
But the terrifying part is that the foundation of these digital empires is incredibly leaky. The same day we read about these massive expansions, we have two major cybersecurity disasters.
Oh, yes. Booking.com and Adobe.
Booking.com had to confirm that hackers breached their systems and stole massive amounts of customer data. Names, physical addresses, phone numbers, all right before the summer travel season.
That's awful.
And Adobe, a software company used by almost every business on Earth, had to issue an emergency fix for a zero-day PDF flaw.
And we should clarify what a zero-day flaw is, because it highlights the vulnerability of these systems.
Makes sense.
A zero-day vulnerability means there is a critical flaw in the software's code that the software developer, in this case Adobe, was completely unaware of. However, malicious hackers discovered it first.
Okay.
The term zero-day means the developers had had 0 days to prepare a defense. In this instance, hackers have been actively exploiting this hidden flaw to gain unauthorized access to systems since November of 2025.
Wow. For months, the door was wide open and the people who built the house didn't even know.
Exactly.
So tie all this together for me. The AI drones, the tech acquisitions, the hacks. What is the big picture here?
The big picture is a fundamental shift in where power resides globally. As traditional geographic nation-states struggle with massive debt, political gridlock, and military recruitment, these tech megacorporations are effectively building their own sovereign digital and orbital empires.
Right.
They control the satellites, they control the data flows, and they're building the artificial intelligence that will run the global economy. Yet, as the Booking.com and Adobe breaches show, these corporate empires are incredibly vulnerable to asymmetrical attacks.
They wield power that rivals a sovereign nation, but they are governed by boards of directors, not democratic mandates.
It is a brave and, frankly, very unstable new world.
Okay, we need to take a deep breath. We have covered space, the oceans, ancient Rome, and AI, but we are going to transition to the most critical, heavily weighted, and globally interconnected story of the day.
The Strait of Hormuz.
Yes, this is the geopolitical anchor that is currently dragging the entire global economy into very dark waters. I am talking about the escalating crisis in the Strait of Hormuz.
This is the flashpoint. Every foreign ministry and defense department on the planet is laser-focused on this specific stretch of water.
We have been looking at reports from CBS News, Al Jazeera, the BBC, and the Washington Post. Let's lay out the facts on the ground as clearly as possible. The United States has formally initiated a military blockade of Iranian ports situated in the Strait of Hormuz.
That's a huge escalation.
Massive. U.S. President Donald Trump ordered this blockade as part of a maximum pressure campaign with the stated goal of forcing Iran to permanently and verifiably end its nuclear program. And the rhetoric is incredibly aggressive.
What did he say?
Trump has publicly vowed that U.S. naval forces will completely destroy any Iranian boats, fast attack craft, or warships that attempt to approach or harass American vessels enforcing this blockade.
To truly grasp the severity of this, you have to understand the physical geography of the Strait of Hormuz. This isn't just any body of water.
Right. Paint the picture for us.
It is a narrow, V-shaped choke point connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman and eventually the open ocean. At its narrowest point, the strait is only about 21 miles wide.
That's tiny.
But the actual shipping lanes, the deep water required for massive oil supertankers to safely pass, those are only 2 miles wide in either direction.
And Iran sits entirely along the northern coast of that choke point.
Exactly. They control half the coastline.
Mm.
And approximately 1/5 of the entire world's daily oil supply must pass through those 2-mile-wide lanes.
And Iran is not just absorbing this blockade quietly. They are pushing back using the leverage of that geography.
What's their response?
Ibrahim Azizi, the head of the Iranian parliament's National Security and Foreign Policy Committee, announced an asymmetrical counter-move. Iran is threatening to pass a bill that would charge massive, exorbitant tolls to ships from any nations they deem hostile.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, they are framing it as legal compensation for the immense economic damage caused by years of Western sanctions and this new blockade.
It is a highly calculated, incredibly dangerous strategy. Iran's naval forces know they cannot survive a direct, ship-to-ship conventional war with the U.S. Navy. However, by threatening to stop board or heavily tax commercial supertankers in that narrow channel, they can effectively weaponize global trade.
Right, they just choke it off.
They can make the cost of insurance and transit so astronomically high that shipping companies simply refuse to enter the Gulf.
Which instantly cuts off 1/5 of the world's oil. The diplomatic scramble to prevent this from spiraling into an open shooting war is frantic. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer has announced that the UK and France will co-host urgent emergency talks this week to address the crisis and try to secure some guarantee of safe passage for commercial vessels.
Because the direct back-channel talks have completely collapsed.
Yes, the reports from the region indicate that U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance was dispatched to Islamabad, Pakistan, to attempt to negotiate a ceasefire framework with Iranian intermediaries.
And how did that go?
It was a total failure. According to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was briefed on the outcome, those talks didn't just stall, they exploded.
Exploded.
That's his word. Netanyahu stated that Vance called him directly from Air Force Two while flying back, citing continuous Iranian ceasefire violations as the reason the U.S. walked away from the table. So, diplomacy is dead, the warships are in place, and the blockade is active.
This is where things get really complicated.
Now, when you look at how the world is reacting to this, there's a very sharp, very entrenched divide in the strategic logic. Let's lay both perspectives out civilly because they represent fundamentally different views of how to manage global threats.
A vital exercise because the stakes are existential for the region.
From the right-leaning, more hawkish U.S. and Israeli perspective, this blockade is viewed as a harsh but absolute necessity. The core argument is that a nuclear-armed Iran is an unacceptable existential threat to the survival of Israel and to the broader stability of the entire Middle East.
Right, that's the deterrence argument.
Proponents of the blockade argue that decades of soft diplomacy, treaties, and minor sanctions have failed to stop Tehran's nuclear ambitions or their funding of proxy groups across the region. Therefore, a massive, undeniable projection of hard power, literally cutting off their ports entirely, is the only language the regime understands.
Okay.
The logic is that you have to cripple their economy completely to force them to capitulate and secure long-term peace.
I understand the architecture of that argument. It
Yeah.
relies on the doctrine of overwhelming deterrence. If you make the pain of resistance unbearable, the adversary must submit.
Right. But there is another side to this.
Yes, if you examine the left-leaning or more internationalist and diplomatic perspective, this unilateral blockade is viewed not as a solution, but as an incredibly reckless and aggressive escalation.
How so?
Critics, including Chinese and Russian diplomats who have condemned the move, argue that a naval blockade is historically defined as an act of war under international law.
So they see it as an offensive move.
Yes. They argue that by bypassing the United Nations and unilaterally choking off Iran's primary economic lifeline, the U.S. is backing a heavily armed, proud nation into a corner where they feel they have nothing left to lose.
The cornered animal theory.
Exactly. The internationalist perspective warns that this maximum pressure doesn't force peace. It makes a regional conflagration inevitable. If Iran retaliates by mining the strait or launching anti-airship missiles from the coast, you don't just have a standoff.
You have a war.
You have a massive multi-nation war that could draw in allies on both sides and devastate the region for generations.
And while the diplomats and military strategists debate game theory, the actual shockwave of the standoff is hitting the global economy right now, because the mere threat of that 2-mile-wide lane closing has sent the markets into a panic.
The oil markets, specifically.
Yes, CBS News reports that physical oil prices have surged, hovering around the psychologically devastating mark of $100 a barrel, with massive daily volatility.
And we have to unpack what $100 a barrel oil actually means. It is not just about paying a few dollars more when you fill up your car. Oil is the blood of the global economy.
It affects everything.
When the price of crude spikes, it acts as a massive regressive tax on everything. It increases the cost of maritime shipping, aviation, trucking, and manufacturing. Furthermore, modern agriculture is heavily dependent on petrochemicals to produce the fertilizers that grow the world's food.
And we are seeing the human cost of that inflation play out in real time. Let's look at the ripple effects. In Port-au-Prince, Haiti, Yahoo News is reporting massive civil unrest. Surging global oil prices have sparked riots.
Wow.
Over 1,000 garment workers took to the streets demanding higher minimum wages. Why? Because the cost of basic public transport to get to work and the cost of the food imported into the country has skyrocketed entirely out of their reach.
It is a stunning example of interconnectedness. A geopolitical standoff in a Middle Eastern strait immediately triggers a crisis of survival for a factory worker in the Caribbean.
And the anger is everywhere. Look at Australia. RT reported that the Australian government, trying to manage the supply crunch, spent $14 million on a public advertising campaign called Every Little Bit Helps.
What was the campaign about?
They are literally running ads telling citizens to make sure their car tires are properly inflated, to remove roof racks, to reduce drag, and to take the bus to save national fuel reserves.
I can imagine how well that was received by the public.
With absolute outrage. People are furious, calling it a ridiculous, patronizing waste of $14 million that should have been used to directly subsidize the working class struggling at the pump.
Naturally.
And back in the U.S., the agricultural sector is getting hammered. Farmers are paying the ultimate price, squeezed simultaneously by the astronomical costs of diesel fuel to run their combine harvesters and the surging cost of fertilizer to plant their crops.
But if you want to understand the true apocalyptic scale of this economic shockwave, you have to look at the latest data from the United Nations.
What does the report say?
A newly released UN report projects that this U.S.-Israeli standoff with Iran and the resulting blockade and oil price shock could push up to 32 million people into extreme poverty across 162 different countries.
32 million people.
Yes, because low-income, debt-saddled, and import-dependent nations simply do not have the economic shock absorbers to handle a sudden, massive spike in the cost of energy and food.
That's devastating.
Decades of gradual, hard-fought global development progress could be erased in a matter of months, simply because the flow of resources through one tiny geographic choke point was disrupted.
32 million lives derailed. It is incredibly heavy. The sheer scale of the fragility is hard to process. So to give our minds a slight pivot and to inject a moment of absolute surreal reality into this heavy news cycle, we have to talk about a bizarre side quest happening amidst all this tension.
I believe you are referring to the situation involving the Vatican.
Yes. While the world braces for economic collapse over Hormuz, President Trump has been engaged in a highly public, deeply strange feud with Pope Leo XIV.
It is a fascinating collision of modern digital populism and ancient religious authority.
It started a few days ago, following a 60 Minutes report where the Pope allegedly made comments critical of certain populist policies. Trump responded by publicly telling the pontiff to stay out of politics.
Right.
But then it escalated in a way only modern politics can. Trump posted an AI-generated image of himself on his social media platform. The image depicted Trump dressed in doctor scrubs, but stylized as a glowing, Jesus-like figure, literally laying hands on and healing the sick.
The blowback was immediate, and it came from his own base.
Absolutely fierce. The BBC and France 24 reported that the image deeply dismayed U.S. Catholics and evangelical Christians. They found it offensive, bordering on blasphemous. The backlash was so intense that Trump actually hastily deleted the post.
He took it down.
He did. He later tried to walk it back, claiming the image was just meant to show him as a doctor fixing the country, but the cultural damage was done. Even the Italian prime minister stepped in, issuing a statement publicly condemning Trump's criticism of the Pope, calling it unacceptable.
What is remarkable is how the Vatican is handling the provocation, which is to say, they are largely ignoring it.
Right. While the U.S. media cycle spins over a deleted AI image, Pope Leo XIV is physically moving. He has embarked on a massive, historic 11-day tour of Africa. He is visiting Algeria, Cameroon, Angola, and Equatorial Guinea. He is actually the first pope in history to ever visit Algeria.
And if we look past the daily noise and connect this back to our earlier theme of empires and systems, this African tour represents a profound, multi-generational geopolitical pivot by the Vatican.
How so?
The Catholic Church operates on a timeline of centuries, not four-year election cycles. And they're looking at the demographics. The Church is witnessing a massive historic boom in adherents and vocations in the global South, particularly across the African continent.
While it declines elsewhere.
Conversely, they are seeing a steady decline in attendance and influence in the increasingly secular, politically fractured West. By undertaking this grueling 11-day tour, engaging with local African leaders, and promoting interfaith dialogue in places like Algeria, Pope Leo is shifting the center of gravity of the Catholic Church.
He is securing the future of his empire where it is growing.
Yes, and deliberately distancing the Vatican from the political circus and the culture wars of the United States and Europe.
It is a masterclass in playing the long game. The Vatican is looking decades ahead, while U.S. politics seems entirely consumed by the crisis of the hour. And speaking of being consumed by domestic politics, while the U.S. military enforces a global blockade and the economy shakes, the internal political chaos in Washington just keeps churning.
The machinery of partisan politics never pauses.
It really doesn't. The New York Times is reporting 2 major, scandalous resignations from the U.S. Congress today. Texas Republican Congressman Tony Gonzalez is stepping down early, throwing the Texas GOP into an absolute scramble ahead of the upcoming elections.
And on the Democratic side,
On the other side of the aisle, California Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell has announced he will resign amidst very serious emerging allegations of sexual abuse.
it is a stark reminder. You can have aircraft carriers mobilizing in the Persian Gulf. You can have global inflation threatening millions. But the local, domestic scandals, the personal failings, and the relentless partisan maneuvering continue completely unabated. The micro and the macro crises happen simultaneously.
It is exhausting, but it is reality. Okay, we have covered an immense amount of ground today. We really have taken a sweeping journey. We started with the sheer tension of astronauts slamming into the atmosphere to test the life support systems that might take us to Mars.
We dove into the ocean to understand the acoustic physics of sperm whales headbutting.
We looked at the terrifying thermodynamic engine of a 173-mile-per-hour typhoon, and we laughed at the cultural stubbornness keeping America tied to inefficient plumbing.
We went back in time to see how the localized autonomy of a hidden Roman army saved an empire.
And watched modern Europe grapple with that exact same tension in Hungary and the terrifying prospect of a new military draft. We stared into the cold, autonomous logic of AI-driven drone warfare and watched megacorporations expand their digital empires while leaving our data vulnerable.
And finally, we anchored it all in the narrow 2-mile shipping lanes of the Strait of Hormuz.
Where a single geopolitical standoff is threatening to plunge 32 million people into poverty while politicians feud with the Pope over AI-generated memes.
It is a testament to the immense, almost overwhelming complexity of the systems we have built. And as we process all of this data, I want to leave you, the listener, with the final thought to mull over.
Okay, let's hear it.
Think back to that history lesson about Odenathus and the hidden Roman army. The Roman Empire survived the darkest days of its 3rd century crisis, not by tightening its grip and not by centralizing every single decision in Rome.
Right, it adapted.
It survived because it allowed local autonomy.
Hey.
It survived by being loosely connected enough that a catastrophic failure in one province didn't immediately destroy the entire structure.
So how does that relate to us now?
Today, we live in a world that is architected in the exact opposite way. We are so tightly intertwined, so hyper-optimized, and so deeply dependent on centralized global supply chains that a single naval blockade in a tiny Middle Eastern strait can starve a farmer in the American Midwest, spike inflation in Europe, and spark a violent riot in Haiti.
Everything is connected.
The fundamental question we must ask ourselves as we look at the future is this. In our quest for absolute efficiency and global connection, have we become too interconnected to survive a modern crisis?
That is a chilling but absolutely necessary question to ask as we look at the systems around us. A huge thank you to you, our listener, for spending this time with us on this deep dive. Navigating these incredibly complex, rapidly shifting currents isn't easy, but understanding how the mechanics work, how the systems connect, is the first step. Keep questioning the narratives, keep looking for those hidden connections, and until next time, keep exploring.
Enjoying Artificially Informed.
Hit subscribe and share it with a friend.
From the left, the right, and straight from the algorithm.
Thank you.
Welcome to The Debate. You know, in emergency medicine, when you are dealing with a catastrophic hemorrhage, the protocol often calls for a tourniquet.
Right.
You apply this immense localized pressure just to cut off the blood flow. And I mean, it's a violent pact. It causes profound pain, and it basically starves the extremity of oxygen.
Yeah, it's not a gentle process.
Exactly. But you do it because it is really the only way to stop the patient from bleeding out, to stabilize the entire system. And right now, we are watching the United States apply a geopolitical tourniquet to the global economy.
By enforcing that military blockade of Iranian ports in the Strait of Hormuz.
Precisely.
I mean, it is a very vivid image, but any trauma surgeon will also tell you that a tourniquet is a desperate measure with a terrifying ticking clock.
Sure.
If you leave it on for too long, the tissue dies. You might stabilize the vital organs for a brief moment, but you risk gangrene, systemic shock, and, well, ultimately having to amputate the limb just to save the patient.
And that precarious balance between necessary stabilization and systemic shock is precisely what we are unpacking today.
Yeah.
Because the Strait of Hormuz is this vital maritime choke point. It's a narrow waterway that handles a massive portion of the world's oil supply, and closing it has sent absolute shockwaves across the planet.
Total shockwaves. I mean, we saw physical oil prices spike to nearly $150 a barrel before finally settling near $100.
Right. And we are seeing the United Nations warn that the resulting energy shock could push 32 million people into poverty across 162 countries.
Which is setting off this flurry of massive diplomatic realignments reaching from China all the way across the globe to Latin America. The tectonic plates of the global order are just shifting in real time right now.
Exactly. So the fundamental question we're facing today is whether this maximum pressure campaign is a necessary mechanism. Like, is this blockade the required catalyst to enforce global security, force adversarial nations to the negotiating table, and, accelerate a transition toward energy independence?
Or conversely, is it a reckless overreach, one that is going to devastate the global economy and actually accelerate the fracturing of the current world order in favor of rival powers.
Right. And for my part, I look at the data, and despite the undeniable short-term economic pain, I see a strategy that is actually working. I mean, it is demonstrating the hard power resolve necessary to counter state-sponsored disruption.
And I look at that exact same data and I see a completely economically ruinous strategy. The human and economic collateral damage of this blockade far outweighs any speculative diplomatic gains.
You really think so?
I do. It is disproportionately devastating the global south, alienating historic allies, and ultimately accelerating a multipolar realignment toward powers like China and Russia.
Well, let's just break down what is actually happening on the ground, starting with the markets.
Okay.
Because if you look at this from the outside, the initial shock to the system was frightening. But look at the data coming in now. Despite the initial panic, stock indices like the S&P 500 have actually ticked higher. They have erased their war-related losses entirely.
Well, sure, the S&P...
And Brent crude oil has pulled back from those terrifying $150 highs to hover right around $100 a barrel. The markets are stabilizing precisely because the pressure is working.
Wait, stabilizing?
Yes, it is forcing genuine diplomatic action. We are seeing Iran and the U.S. actively exploring a second round of peace talks following the initial discussions in Pakistan, which were led by Vice President J.D. Vance.
Right, but...
We are even seeing incredibly rare direct talks between Israel and Lebanon happening right now in Washington, hosted by Senator Marco Rubio.
Okay, I have to stop you there. You say the markets are stabilizing, but we really need to ask stabilizing for whom?
For the global economy.
No, you are looking at this through a very Western, highly insulated financial lens. The S&P 500 recovering does not mean the global economy is stable.
It's a strong indicator, though.
If we're taking a truly planetary perspective, the reality is incredibly grim. I mean, the United Nations report explicitly warns that this energy shock could push 32 million people into poverty.
I know the UN numbers.
They estimate it will require $6 billion in cash transfers just to mitigate the immediate humanitarian damage. You are essentially punishing the entire planet for a regional dispute.
Look, I am not going to sit here and pretend that $100 a barrel oil isn't hurting people. It is. I don't deny the humanitarian strain.
But it is far more than a strain. It is a systemic fracture. And diplomatically, this approach is isolating the West. While the United States relies on military blockades and threats to sink Iranian ships, China is capitalizing diplomatically.
Well, China is always going to look for an opening.
Yes, and they found a massive one. President Xi Jinping recently met with the UAE Crown Prince in Beijing to propose a 4-point Middle East stability plan. The strategy you are defending isn't creating a lasting peace. It is actively driving the global south to build an alternative world order.
I think we need to dig into the mechanics of that economic ripple effect, though, because I agree that disruptions are vast, but I view them as a necessary correction.
A necessary correction? Let me explain exactly how this economic shockwave moves globally, because the mechanics are catastrophic.
Go ahead.
Take Haiti, for example. We just saw over 1,000 workers clashing with police in Port-au-Prince. Why? Because when oil prices surge, the cost of everything else surges with it.
Right. Inflation hits the import-dependent nations hardest.
Exactly. The cost of living becomes literally unbearable. And these workers are demanding an increase to their minimum wage just to survive. Or look at the Asia-Pacific sector. The aviation industry there is facing a massive jet fuel vulnerability because 90% of Asia's crude oil passes through the Strait of Hormuz. When you choke off that supply, aviation profit margins, which are already razor-thin, completely evaporate.
Which, ironically, proves exactly how critical it is that the strait not be controlled by a single hostile actor.
I'm not defending Iran's control,
If 90% of Asia's crude passes through there, we simply cannot allow state-sponsored disruption to hold the global economy hostage. We have to secure the choke point.
But the U.S. blockade itself is what is triggering the crisis for these nations. The United States is effectively exporting inflation right now.
That's a strong phrase.
It's the reality. Think about vulnerable economies like Bangladesh and Pakistan. They are now facing stagflation, a paralyzing mix of stagnant economic growth and rising inflation.
Which is a tragic consequence, yes.
And here's the underlying mechanism. Global energy is priced in U.S. dollars.
When oil spikes, these nations don't just have to pay more for fuel. Their local currencies usually depreciate against the dollar at the exact same time.
That's standard macroeconomics, yeah.
Right, and they are already reliant on IMF support, and now their foreign reserves are being completely drained just to keep the lights on. We are watching low-income, import-dependent nations suffocate because of a blockade they had absolutely no say in.
Wait, let me challenge you on that. Are you arguing that we should just allow nuclear proliferation and the disruption of international shipping to go completely unchecked just to keep oil prices artificially low for import-dependent nations?
No, I am saying
Because we have to look at the macro and geopolitical corrections occurring simultaneously here. You mentioned the broader multipolar threat, right? China capitalizing on this.
yes.
Well, look at how this blockade actually impacts global rivals. Chinese exports have slowed to just 2.5% growth recently.
Okay.
Analysts directly attribute this to the surging material and shipping costs brought on by the crisis in the Strait of Hormuz. So in effect, this blockade checks a major geopolitical rival's economic expansion.
Are you seriously arguing that pushing 32 million people into poverty across the global south is an acceptable price to pay just to slightly slow down Chinese manufacturing?
I see why you think that's callous, but let me give you a slightly different perspective. Isn't this economic disruption a necessary, albeit painful, growing pain?
A growing pain.
Let's use a recent historical parallel. Europe had to painfully decouple from Russian gas over the last few years.
Right.
It was incredibly disruptive. They endured massive price spikes, inflation, real fear about winter heating. But wasn't that shock necessary to finally break their dependence on an authoritarian energy monopoly?
Well, sure, for Europe.
I would argue the entire globe needs this exact kind of shock right now. The former Uruguayan energy secretary noted that this conflict might accelerate the global transition to renewable energy out of sheer necessity. We simply cannot transition if the status quo remains comfortable and cheap.
That is a compelling way to frame it theoretically, I'll give you that. But the analogy falls apart completely when you look at the actual victims on the ground.
How so?
Europe had the financial buffer, they had the robust institutions and the capital to survive a painful decoupling from Russian gas. The global south does not have that luxury.
They have international aid mechanisms,
Which are already stretched past the breaking point. When energy prices double for a country already facing a sovereign debt crisis, they don't magically transition to solar power. They don't have the capital for green infrastructure. Their economies collapse, and their people starve.
But those moments of acute pressure are precisely why we are seeing unprecedented diplomatic action. The economic pressure is the lever.
A very dangerous lever.
Look at what is happening diplomatically, though. UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and France are co-hosting talks this week, specifically to address the Strait of Hormuz crisis. The blockade has galvanized international diplomacy in a way we simply haven't seen in years.
Galvanized out of panic, maybe?
Vice President Vance has explicitly stated that progress was made with Iran and Pakistan, and that the ball is in Tehran's court for a second round of talks. And, let's not gloss over Lebanon and Israel engaging in direct talks in Washington.
Which is surprising, yes.
That is monumental. They don't have formal diplomatic relations, and Hezbollah leader Naim Qassem explicitly demanded that Lebanon cancel the meeting. Yet it is happening anyway. That is real, tangible diplomatic momentum forged in the fires of this maximum pressure campaign.
I come at it from a completely different way.
Okay.
Using a global economic blockade to force a peace deal is like locking the doors of a burning building to force the occupants to agree on a fire escape plan.
That's quite an analogy.
It fits. It doesn't create genuine consensus. It just makes the trapped nations look for another exit. And right now, Beijing is holding the door wide open.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning. The U.S. is the one actively hosting these historic talks in Washington. The world is coming to the American table.
The U.S. is hosting localized talks while simultaneously enforcing a blockade, but China is stepping in as the great mediator for the broader region.
Mediator is a strong word for what China is doing.
While the United States threatens military force, China is executing a highly sophisticated diplomatic strategy. President Xi Jinping's meeting with the UAE Crown Prince emphasized a four-point stability plan rooted in international rule of law and the UN.
Which is very convenient rhetoric for them.
But it's a direct, implicit critique of unilateral U.S. military action, and it resonates deeply in the region.
Furthermore, you have to look at the rebellion happening right now against Western financial hegemony.
You are referring to the Borrowers Forum in Washington?
Exactly. Right in Washington, D.C., during the IMF and World Bank spring meetings, countries like Egypt, Pakistan, Zambia, the Maldives, and the Philippines are launching a UN-hosted Borrowers Forum.
Yes, I saw that.
We really need to understand why this matters. They are openly challenging the IMF's debt system because the current architecture forces them into an impossible choice.
Debt servicing versus domestic subsidies.
Right. When an oil shock hits, they have to decide between servicing their foreign debt or subsidizing fuel and food so their citizens don't literally starve. They are demanding a new framework. The Global South is not uniting behind Western diplomacy. They are actively building structures to bypass it.
I think you are vastly overstating the degree of this multipolar realignment, though. The narrative that the West is fracturing and the entire Global South is seamlessly aligning with China just ignores the actual political realities.
Does it?
Yes, it ignores the resiliency of Western alliances. Let's look at Europe. The consensus there is actually strengthening in key areas.
I wouldn't say strengthening.
Take Hungary, for instance. Viktor Orban has been a major thorn in the side of unified European foreign policy for years, often acting as a proponent of ties with Russia.
True.
He was just ousted in a landslide election by Peter Magyar. This explicitly shows the limits of right-wing populism and brings Hungary much closer to EU alignment.
I would urge caution there. Magyar maintains a fairly cautious stance on Ukraine and a conservative view on immigration. It is certainly a shift, but it's not a complete pivot to the Brussels consensus.
It may not be a complete pivot overnight, no. But look at how European leadership is utilizing this momentum.
How so?
European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen is using this exact window to push for the abolition of the veto power in the EU.
Ah, yes.
For our listeners who might not follow EU procedural mechanics closely, currently, EU foreign policy requires unanimity. A single dissenting nation can effectively hold the entire continent hostage and block unified action.
Right.
Abolishing that veto power streamlines unified foreign policy. That is a massive structural move toward deeper Western integration. Furthermore, Germany and Ukraine have just upgraded their relations to a strategic partnership. And German drone maker Quantum Systems is expanding joint ventures with Ukraine. The Western alliance is adapting and solidifying its security architecture. It is not crumbling.
The idea that Western consensus is solidifying is an illusion, frankly, if you look beyond a few highly publicized defense agreements.
An illusion?
Yes. You mentioned Europe unifying, but look at Italy. Italy has literally just suspended its defense agreement with Israel over the Lebanon attacks, accusing Israeli forces of firing warning shots.
That's a specific regional disagreement, though.
That is a G7 nation breaking ranks on security cooperation. And look at Spain. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez is in Beijing right now, his fourth visit in 4 years. He is directly calling for the EU to view China as a strategic ally rather than a rival.
But isn't that just Spain trying to solve its own domestic trade deficit issues? I mean, it's economics, not a grand security realignment.
Of course it is about domestic interests, but that is exactly the point. He is actively seeking to increase Spanish agricultural exports to China and begging for Chinese infrastructure investment.
Right.
He is openly stating he wants to be a bridge between the EU and China amid these strained relations with the US over the Iran conflict. When the pressure gets too high, nations prioritize their own economic survival over a unified Western security posture.
I agree the alliances are complex. If we look globally from a planetary perspective, the geopolitical map is definitely shifting. But it is far more nuanced than just, everyone is fleeing to China.
It is incredibly nuanced, which is exactly why blunt instruments like military blockades fail. They don't account for local economic realities.
Well,
look at Latin America. You have total fragmentation based on how these global economic shocks hit local economies. On one hand, you have Argentina's President Javier Milei receiving the Presidential Medal of Honor from Israeli President Isaac Herzog, strengthening those bilateral ties.
Right, a clear alignment with the West.
But right next door in Venezuela, the minimum wage is sitting at 130 bolívares. That is about 28 US cents.
The Venezuelan economy has been broken for a long time, though.
Yes, but when global energy and shipping prices skyrocket because of the Strait of Hormuz, economies like Venezuela's, which are already decimated, face catastrophic humanitarian outcomes. The planet is not uniting behind the U.S. to force a new security order. It is fragmenting to protect its own immediate interests from the fallout of this exact blockade.
I hear the argument about fragmentation, and I certainly don't dismiss the localized economic pain. But I really struggle to see a viable alternative mechanism that actually addresses the root problem here.
Diplomacy doesn't require a global chokehold.
If the West does not enforce red lines, whether we are talking about nuclear proliferation or state-sponsored disruption of global shipping, then the international system collapses anyway, just over a longer timeline.
That's a very fatalistic view.
It's realistic. You cannot have a functional global economy if vital choke points like the Strait of Hormuz can be held hostage by regional powers whenever they want leverage. The blockade forces the issue.
At an unimaginable cost.
It brings the crisis to a head so it can be resolved structurally, rather than just allowing a slow, agonizing bleed of international norms.
But the resolution you were pointing to is built entirely on coercion. And historically, coerced agreements rarely hold.
They hold when the economic incentives align afterward.
When you enforce a blockade that threatens the energy supply of 90% of Asia, you are not just pressuring Iran. You are threatening the core national security of India, China, Japan, and South Korea.
True.
You literally force them to find alternative systems that circumvent U.S. control. That is why the multipolar realignment is the most significant long-term outcome of this crisis. It is not just diplomatic posturing. It is a fundamental structural redesign of global supply chains and financial systems to make them immune to U.S. blockades in the future.
And yet, despite that push toward alternative systems, it is still Western diplomacy that is currently facilitating the most critical dialogues.
Some of them.
We circle back to Senator Rubio hosting Israeli and Lebanese envoys for the first direct talks in decades. That is a monumental achievement that only happened because the pressure in the region reached a boiling point. The U.S.-led order is demonstrating that it still holds the unique convening power to bring historic adversaries to the table right in Washington.
Convening a meeting while simultaneously threatening to sink ships and causing 32 million people to face poverty is not a sustainable model of global leadership. It is, frankly, crisis management by arson.
Well, I think this is a perfect place to draw our arguments together and just let the listener weigh the evidence.
I agree.
If I look at the entirety of what we've discussed today, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz and the U.S. blockade is undoubtedly a moment of profound global stress. However, bold, decisive pressure is the only mechanism capable of forcing necessary diplomatic breakthroughs, like the historic talks we are seeing in Washington and the ongoing negotiations with Iran. Furthermore, the economic shock of this blockade serves as a harsh but entirely necessary catalyst to accelerate the structural transition toward global energy independence, ultimately breaking the world's reliance on authoritarian monopolies.
And from my perspective, the evidence shows that this blockade is a deeply reckless, blunt instrument. The catastrophic poverty it is inflicting on the global south, combined with the exporting of stagflation and the alienation of our European allies, far outweighs any localized diplomatic meetings.
Right.
Ultimately, this strategy of maximum pressure is hastening the end of Western geopolitical dominance. It's driving nations into the arms of a multipolar coalition led by China out of sheer economic survival.
Despite our deep disagreements on the efficacy and the morality of the blockade, I think we both clearly converge on one undeniable reality.
Which is?
This is a watershed moment in modern history. The disruption in the Strait of Hormuz is permanently restructuring global trade, energy supply chains, and the architecture of diplomatic alliances.
Absolutely. I completely agree. The world before this blockade and the world after it will look fundamentally different.
Yeah.
The tension that remains is whether the ultimate outcome will be a reformed, more secure international system led by Western diplomacy, or a deeply fragmented, multipolar world where China and a coalition of global South nations dictate the new economic reality.
And that really underscores the absolute necessity of viewing these crises not just through a regional or even a national lens, but from a truly planetary perspective.
Exactly.
The true impact of these events on the global economy and international relations will just continue to unfold, and we will watch closely to see whether applying that tourniquet ultimately saves the global patient or whether it causes irreversible systemic shock.
Right.
We have to wait and see if the cure proves more devastating than the disease.
Thank you for joining us on the debate. We leave it to you, the listener, to draw your own conclusions.
That's it for today's Artificially Informed.
Nope. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Yeah.
Stay sharp, stay curious. See you next time.